When you are designing something, especially something that's going to be mass produced, it's very important to understand the piece count. How many different individual pieces are going to make up the total item? Are they all made out of the same material? Do you have to source them from different factories? Usually this starts with something called an exploded diagram, which is what this is, showing all the pieces of something. And it's no different from toys. Toys work the exact same way, whether they have fabric, soft good cape, they're all made out of plastic, PVC. It has to be figured out early on because all of it rolls into what's called the tooling budget. And I've talked about tooling quite a lot, but for those uninitiated, or if this is your first Spector Creative video ever, tooling is the giant metal mold that all plastic toys, anything made out of plastic, comes out of. Essentially, it's an injection molded tool where plastic is injected in and it creates whatever is in the shape of the mold. You then open up the mold and take out your plastic toy. Usually it's going to come out on something called a tree or a sprue, which is when it's attached to other items and you have to kind of like model kits. We sometimes get these assembled like this, but at the factory, everything has to be removed from the plastic tree or spree or sprue, different names for it, and then attached. So how much tooling do you get for a product? Well, that all has to do with how well it sells. The better an item sells, the more tooling is going to be allocated for it, which means you can have a more accurate character. And all of this has to do with allocation of resources. It works like this with any company. The more something sells, the more resources are going to be thrown at it, both in terms of human power, personnel, and actual product pieces. So when a toy company announces a new line of figures, you can usually tell how well it's doing by how many newly tooled or partially tooled figures are in the lineup. The more there are, the more it's selling and, well, the better off the line is doing as a whole. So, for example, my antenna here is a fully tooled, 100% brand new figure. There's not a single part of him that is reused from another figure. Maybe his accessory. I don't know, I'd have to compare it. But his body, 90% of the figure, is fully new. It doesn't reuse anything from a previous figure. Versus something like this, where you have original Stratos and mini comic Stratos, this is what's called a redeco, where you're taking an existing tool and you're putting it in new colors. Now, the reason tooling is so important to track early on is because it's expensive. One of those big metal tool molds will cost about $100,000 for a new figure. So plotting out a full year is extremely important. And usually, while plotting out a full year product line, you're going to allocate and indicate which figures are fully tooled, partially tooled, meaning they get some new parts, some reuse. Some of them are deco only, so just painting it different, and some of them are existing figures just put in a new package. By combining all those different possibilities, you can create a line that is profitable. If you try to make every figure fully tooled, well, you're throwing a lot of money at tooling, and it's going to lower your margin. By looking at what parts can get reused and then strategically adding new parts, well, it allows for characters and toys to be created very creatively. And by having the entire lineup in front of you, you essentially have your total tooling allocation and you can spread it out over all of the SKUs in your brand and allocate more tooling, less tooling, knowing that you have a total tooling budget you have to use. So let's look at a specific example. So here we have Anti-Eternia He-Man. So you'll notice there's a picture of the figure on the left, and then on the right is the designer's best guess at what parts can be reused and what parts need to be made new. So in that case, you can see this particular character reuses a lot of pieces from He-Man. The original plan was to give him a new head and a new weapon, but those actually both got costed out eventually, and he became a straight repaint figure, getting no new allocated tooling. Let's look at another example that has a lot of tooling. So this was the plan for Sagittar, and you could see almost the entire figure was new. There were some forearms and hands that he was able to borrow, some shoulders, but otherwise this figure required new parts for almost every single piece of the figure. All of this has to be worked out in advance. And it's the same for vehicles, for playsets, for pack-in figures. Everything goes through this where you're going to analyze the figure or the vehicle, the toy, and figure out what pieces have to be tooled new and which pieces can be reused from previous figures. And it doesn't even have to be basic figures. This is a case with Tuscador where a lot of his parts were going to come from Ram Man. So again, it's all about knowing what tools are available in your, call it tooling bank or tooling library, and being able to repurpose them. So here's another figure that was proposed to use the Ram Man buck or Ram Man body. Most of the body would come from Ram Man, but armor and hammer and head would be newly tooled in order to make an original character. Whenever you're trying to make the case to get tooling, you essentially have to show, one, that it's worth it from the revenue that's going to be brought in from sales, but two, you also have to show how the tooling might then be able to be repurposed later on. So as an example, sticking with the Masters of the Universe Classics lineup, we had two different robotic horses, Strider and Night Stalker. Granted, Night Stalker wound up coming out first, but let's just pretend Strider did it here in the original plan, and you can see it's almost a completely new figure. Every single piece has to be new. The head, the body, the legs. But when we get to our second robotic horse, everything is taken from the first one. So all the parts here are indicated coming from Stridor. Granted, we flip-flopped them in the release, and Night Stalker came out first, but you could see how the process works. The more sales, the more tooling, but if you want a fully tooled figure like those robotic horses, you might have to make the case that, well, if you give us this tooling, we'll actually be able to get multiple figures out of it. Now, it also has a lot to do with MOQ. Factories charge more when they have to make fewer figures below their minimum order quantity. This happens a lot at conventions, like when you're producing an exclusive toy for San Diego Comic-Con, you're going to produce it at a much lower quota than you would for a retail item. The lower the quota, the higher the cost, so you're not going to want to put tooling against that. So here's an example of an item that was proposed for San Diego Comic-Con, a Prince Randor versus Prince Keldor and Prince Keldor team-up pack. And most of the parts were new. Very few new pieces were needed. New guns, new capes, new heads, but otherwise it was mostly reuse. This is why San Diego Comic-Con figures are often just repaints, because the quota is so low that if you were to put tooling against it, it would drag down the margin. So here you could see Fozzie released for San Diego Comic-Con in clear deco, replicating when he took the invisibility potion in Muppets in Space. Was it a potion? I can't quite remember. But the point is he became invisible. The same thing using the Muppets line for the Swedish Chef. Originally, he was tooled and developed for a playset. The tooling would have been allocated against the playset, but a San Diego Comic-Con version was then released with minimal new tooling for the lobsters and then repaint on his outfit. So you could amortize the tooling over multiple figures. You say, hey, give us the money to tool up Princess Leia, and then for San Diego, we'll be able to do a hologram version by casting her in clear plastic with zero tooling. So the 100% tooled figure you had to pay for in the main line is then made up for with the convention item. Again, another version of using extra accessories with an existing figure for a convention-based figure, this Sith Trooper. Now, sometimes you don't get the tooling you want. And a great example of that is back in Motu Classics, we're using that as an example again, when we did the the Rock Warriors, Rock On and Stone Dar, two of my favorite toys growing up. Well, originally they were going to be more toy accurate with the bands that went across the upper thighs. You could see that actually in the original paint model, which was used for the back cross-sell on the actual package. But alas, when you got the actual figures, they didn't have the bands on their legs because we couldn't afford it. We could not afford to tool new legs with bands, so we had to use the existing ones. We basically used up our tooling in order to give them all the rock pieces that they needed. So not all the time are you going to get and be able to make that case. Many, many times, in fact, most of the time, management will be like, can't you just make this with existing parts? Do you really need that much tooling? Because tooling is a one-time huge capital investment, and you want to invest as little as possible in tooling. If you can repaint a figure and sell an existing tool again, you're just amortizing that one-time huge sunk cost, that $100,000. So a lot of it is about compromising. You have to sort of say, okay, well, I'd like this figure to come out like this, but I understand I can't have all the tooling. Sometimes you have to be clever, and a clever brand manager will be able to look back at what's, again, called a tooling bank of all the available pieces that are already tooled. So when we did the JLU question figure for Mattel, one of the figures that really needed to be in the lineup because he was a major character in the third season, he was originally going to be fully tooled. But then it turned out, oh wait, we have this Two-Face figure that we did about 10 years ago, and we could use that suit body. So that was a clever tool reuse. So here, again, going back to Motu Classics, Anti-He-Man, while originally going to get some new tooling, wound up becoming a repaint only. But it's all worked out ahead of time exactly which pieces per figure, per SKU, need to be tooled. I hope this video is insightful in how tooling works and gets allocated. If you have questions about this or would love a follow-up, let me know in the comments below. And as always, sharing this video with others is the best way to support this channel. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the comment section and, well, in the next video. Have a great day.